Once every 4 years, Team USA brings together our nation's most exceptional athletes for the Summer Olympics. In Paris this year, these Olympians will also represent some of our country's amazing clothing manufacturers. Ralph Lauren kept it made in America when crafting this year's opening and closing ceremony attire, drawing on the talents of apparel companies across the U.S., including Ferrara Manufacturing, Andari Fashion Incorporated, Shanico Wool Company, Rancourt & Company, Rogue Industries, and Saytex USA. But the Olympics aren't the only place you can find Made in America clothes. Some of our other great apparel makers have been on a winning streak as well. San Francisco-based American Giant just announced they will offer a line of Made in USA shirts for $12.98 at 1,700 Walmart locations. Meanwhile, companies like Vermont's Darn Tough and Alabama's Zaccano make metal-worthy socks in the United States. And we can't forget about Made in USA brands like American Trench, Devium, Vermont Flannel, Duckworth, American Roots, L.C. King Manufacturing, All American Clothing Company, and a surprising number of others. To those who may have assumed the American apparel industry was dead, this should be a wake-up call. Despite decades of policy aimed at encouraging offshoring, hundreds of American companies continue to make high-quality apparel in the United States. Imagine what would happen if more big retailers and policymakers refocused their energy on Made in America too. It's time to put American makers back on the medal stand.
All right. Welcome, everybody. My name's Scott Paul. I'm president of the Alliance for American Manufacturing. We're honored that you could join us for this celebration of making it in America. We're honored to have Ambassador Tai, Byron Winthrop, a number of other administration officials with us, and to talk about the possibilities. You saw some of them there for the Olympic attire, but that's a small piece of the puzzle in terms of manufacturing, having resilient supply chains, supporting good jobs. And I think it's fair to say we have seen a development of policy and intent over the last few years that we haven't experienced for generations in the United States. And that's one of the conversations that we'll be having today. The first guest we have is appearing virtually for us from Europe. And has a fascinating story himself. He's our ambassador to the European Union, Mark Gittenstein. Ambassador Gittenstein has a long record of public service in the U.S. government and in the U.S. Senate staff as well. Prior to that, and I think this is very interesting to this conversation, he comes from a family that operated a major garment and apparel textile manufacturer in Alabama. And I believe it was called Riverside Underwear and Shirts, if I'm not mistaken. But to bring you that story and why the administration's efforts are so important in terms of having resilient supply chains in the United States, and where that is in the worker-centered trade policy and the investments that we're making in our economy. I'm pleased to have him join us virtually from Europe. Ambassador Gittenstein, welcome.
I'm having a little trouble with my audio. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're coming through loud and clear. Welcome.
Okay, I'm having trouble hearing you. Should I start?
Please do. Please do. Thank you so much, Ambassador.
Okay. Cool, thank you. I'm sorry for the, I'm technologically handicapped. Catherine, Scott, Baird, Heather, Dilip, ladies and gentlemen attending in person and online, thank you for being with us today. I'm here in Brussels. Sorry I can't be with you, but thank you for listening to me for a few minutes. And if you can indulge me for a minute. That's my father, Seymour Gittenstein. He died in 2010 at 95, but he moved to my hometown of Florala, Alabama at 17 from New York in 1932. His family was in the apparel business, shirts, Baird flannel shirts. In the early 1960s, his 1,000 employees were producing flannel and chambray shirts, 2,000 dozen a day. That's 24,000 shirts a day. By 1988, that business was dead. My father not only provided good paying jobs for 50 years, built an hospital for his employees, and sent 2,000 of their children to college. But the population of Florala today is 1/3 smaller. The most recent census numbers show only a few hundred full-time jobs for a town now of only 2,000 people. As Florala was dying, I used to spout back to my father the theory of comparative advantage. I had learned it at my Duke introductory economics class. His response was, quote, "Mark, that's BS. That factory was a lot more than an economic statistic. It was a livelihood, a social network, a work family." I stay in touch now with my old friends in Florala on Facebook, and the anger and impatience with the elite experts here in DC, like me, is palpable. My father was right, and I and all the smarty pants in DC were hopelessly out of touch, or worse, indifferent. What is particularly significant about the event AAM is hosting today is that Baird set out on a mission to capture what my father had done for years: make flannel shirts in America. Author Stephen Kuritz has even written a book, American Flannel, about Baird's efforts, how hard it was to recreate what my family had done for years. The book is just not about rebuilding the capacity to make flannel shirts, but about the broader effort to make textiles and apparel in the United States. Today, the vast majority of clothing worn by Americans is imported, with China, Vietnam, India, Bangladesh, and Mexico accounting for well over half of all the textile and apparel imports into the United States, valued at $71.4 billion in 2023. By contrast, U.S. exports of textiles and apparel that same year to all trading partners totaled $23.1 billion. Looking past the highly unbalanced nature of the trade, employment figures also demonstrate profound changes to the industry in recent decades. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, in 1973, there were more than 2.4 million textile and apparel workers employed in the United States. By 96, that figure had dropped to 1.5 million, a 39% decline over the period. That is what makes Baird's commitment to making apparel in the United States so extraordinary. Something we took for granted, the ability to make a flannel shirt, became a mission for him. And true to the American spirit, despite a surprising number of obstacles in his way, he succeeded. We'll hear more about the state of the industry and the forces shaping it from experts today. But as U.S. Ambassador to the EU, I've seen the growing resolve of leaders in the U.S. and the EU, the two largest democratic free market systems in the world, to respond to the challenges affecting our industrial competitiveness. In my conversations with people here in Brussels and in Washington, one thing is clear. The old thinking about free trade and free markets must change. The relentless drive for what some call efficiency that has characterized our trade and industrial policies over recent decades has in reality been the pursuit of low cost at any cost. Under the Biden-Harris administration, we recognize that the old approach no longer holds. We can no longer ignore the consequences for our workers and for domestic manufacturing. We cannot afford to continue pursuing policies that solely facilitate the delivery of low-cost goods to consumers without considering their environmental impacts or pitting workers against each other across far-flung global supply chains. We must instead focus on retaining the ability to manufacture things within our own borders and the jobs and communities that such economic activity helps to flourish and thrive. If anyone has doubts about how textiles and apparel fit into the picture, just remember who repurposed their facilities to make masks and other life-saving products during the pandemic. People like Baird. We cannot take this industry for granted. We have observed the EU also taking action to address the importance of retaining manufacturing and are encouraged by President von der Leyen's increased focus on a policy agenda meant to enhance EU economic security and competitiveness, particularly in the face of non-market policies and practice employed by third countries that severely distort global markets and adversely impact our workers. Just recently, the EU took bold action to prevent its domestic manufacturers of electric vehicles from heavily subsidized imports from China. It's not a coincidence that leaders on both sides of the Atlantic are finally responding to the threats to our industrial competitiveness by countries that explicitly exploit the rules-based global trading system to their advantage. As Catherine has said many times, trade policy is not siloed from national security. It is a key part of ensuring not just prosperity for our citizens, but the health of our democracy. I applaud Catherine for her efforts to craft a worker-centered U.S. trade policy to respond to the challenges of our time and safeguard American industrial competitiveness and innovation. And I applaud Baird for the commitment not just to American manufacturing, but to the communities that depend on American manufacturing. I grew up in one of those communities. Catherine tells a story from her team following Baird supply chains in the Carolinas a few years back. One of the company owners said that for some of the workers, that job in that factory is the only point of stability in their lives. These are more than just jobs. They are anchors in American life. My dad said that 35 years ago. The Biden-Harris administration is committed not just to American manufacturing, but to the Americans who do the manufacturing. I look forward to this conversation. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Gittenstein. We appreciate your time, your words, and your service. It's very grateful for that. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, we made it work from Europe. One step closer. So I will just briefly introduce the fireside chat participants, the main event here. But I first wanted to say that this is the first time I've ever worn a flannel shirt at an event like this, but there's a reason for that. If you guys know who Jim Koch is, the founder of Boston Brewing that makes Sam Adams, whenever he gives a talk, he brings a bottle of beer with him, Sam Adams, and he pours it and he drinks it while he's having the conversation. Well, I'm not doing that today, but I am wearing the flannel shirt because it is apropos of everything that we're talking about with Bayard and with Ambassador Tai. And just a word about them both. Ambassador Catherine Tai is the 19th USTR, and in my opinion, the very best one. If you have not heard her describe what a worker-centered trade policy is, be sure to do so, because I think she explicates it better than anybody else, and why it's important and what it means. Under her leadership in the Biden-Harris administration, USTR has taken significant actions to lift up American workers and American industries, particularly those that we're trying to kickstart with major investments that we've been making over the last couple of years. Bayard Winthrop is the CEO and founder of American Giant, which got its start about 13 or 14 years ago, and was certainly elevated not only by their product, but by an article in Slate magazine that Farhad Manjoo wrote, said the best damn hoodie ever made. I agree, and was an early adapter of that as well. And Bayard has made a point of growing an amazing company and doing it with an all-American supply chain. And I will just say that together, if you have the investments, the policy, the strategy, and the intent, they can show what is possible for not only textiles and garments in the United States, but for anyone who wants to make things in the United States to make us more economically secure. Please give a warm welcome to Ambassador Catherine Tai and Bayard Winthrop of American Giant.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to share that in advance of this engagement, I think I've had the most conversations I've had of any presentation I've done about what you're going to wear. So, Scott, I'd actually heard before that instead of the flannel shirt, you were going to wear the hoodie. I thought about wearing the hoodie, and I thought, well, if Scott's going to wear the hoodie, I'm just going to wear the sweatshirt. Bayard, of course, is decked out in his American Giant, the signature items with the USA on them. I also wanted to note that having Ambassador Gittenstein give those remarks is a bit of a dream come true for me, this entire event, because it's really the culmination of several years worth of building relationships. Now, I build a lot of relationships around the world, spend a lot of time building relationships with trade ministers in other countries, building relationships within the administration, as you can see, and building relationships with our stakeholders and the people who are actually doing things in the economy and responding to the signals and the policies that we put out there. In getting to know Ambassador Gittenstein, I've done a lot of trips to Brussels. One of the things I learned about him was his childhood in Alabama, and he talks about growing up in Alabama and his father's shirt factory, and over time, I've had enough of these conversations and made enough friends that I started to realize these conversations are connecting with each other. Like our economic policy, like our policy landscape overall, it turns out that everything is connected. So to be able to share with all of you Ambassador Gittenstein's experience growing up in this town where his father's factory was the heart and soul of that town, and for him to be able to tell that story, I think is just a tremendously gratifying for me to be able to share that with a larger audience. In a similar vein, getting to sit down with Bayard, who's become a great friend, and really I think just in a format of two friends having a conversation that will have policy elements, but really also will be about telling the story of what we're passionate about and the kind of change that we are trying to demonstrate, the commitments, the things we're passionate about, and how we're trying to live that passion with integrity is really what this conversation is about. And I'm really looking forward then to handing this off in the next panel to you, Scott, and my colleagues Heather Boucher and Dalip Singh to take it a step further into the White House and have them talk about how they're thinking about national security, economic security, and how they intersect. So Bayard, I thought we would just kick off this conversation And let me do it this way. There are a lot of people that I've encountered in my work as U.S. trade representative and also just working in trade policy for 15 to 20 years now, who will just say things as truisms. And they're things that have been baked into our way of thinking about trade and manufacturing. And one of those things that I've heard quite a lot is, well, the United States is not competitive as a base for manufacturing. When it comes more specifically to textiles and apparel, not only is it not desirable for us to continue to have this kind of industry, but it's just not possible. Apparel in particular, and I wanted to focus there because that's where you work. Apparel, because it's labor intensive, and it's just not in the DNA of the modern American economy to make apparel, and it's not even something that we should want to do. But the bit of background that we've shared with everybody is that you've made it your life's work these last 14 years to do something that people think is impossible. And I want to probe a little bit more about how extraordinary your accomplishments have been, demonstrated in these sweatshirts and this flannel shirt in particular. But why don't I start by asking you, what is it that motivated you in the first place to do something that so many people have dismissed as neither desirable nor possible?
Yeah, I mean, I not exactly, the framing of that question in some ways is strange to me because it does reflect my journey. I started off my career in corporate finance. I read Competitive Advantage. I was sort of indoctrinated into libertarian economic thinking that had consumerism and unfettered capitalism at the core of all of the way that I looked at every economic decision, whether that was in finance or later in manufacturing. Assumed that offshoring for cheaper production was serving a greater good. And I think for me, over that time, as I left finance and got into manufacturing, what happens invariably is you start to build relationships with manufacturers, with humans that are partnering with you, that help to stand up your business over time. And as you break those relationships that are down the street or in a town over or a state over and move them overseas, there's the disconnect from the product itself. But there's also the reality that those human connections begin to break, and there's impacts from those decisions. And I think I'd reached a point in my career of doing that repeatedly where I kind of had enough of that. I think I'm 55 now. I started the business about 13 or 14 years ago. I just had my first child, and I was thinking a lot about that. I was thinking a lot about, is that my legacy, that I'm going to chase 15 cents and break relationships for people that stood by me through a lot of stuff. And as sort of I don't know, pedantic as that sounds, I really was beginning to think about that, and out of that, year-long or more marination and growing resolve about it, I decided that I wanted to build an apparel business that I knew I'd be proud of. I didn't know if it'd be big or small, or successful or not, but I knew it was a business I wanted to run, and so American Giant kind of emerged out of that idea. It was pretty simple at the time. I'm old enough to remember growing up and going to Caldors and getting a great sweatshirt that my mom could afford, and that was American made, and that was no longer part of my reality at all. And so that too kind of kicked off an interesting discussion for me about why is that? Why is it that 50 years ago we lived in a country that had towns like Ambassador Gittenstein's town. You can tell he's the real deal because he referred to in thousands of dozens. I don't know if you caught that, but that means he grew up in a textile town when you were talking about dozens and not units. But why is that? And those towns scattered all across the urban and rural landscape of America were anchored by textile facilities and other manufacturing facilities that were more than a statistic, that were embedded into and creating this sort of fabric of community. Why have we lost that? And why, I know everyone's telling me that can't happen again, but why can't it? And so I think that it was naive in the beginning, but that's how we got started, and it, I think it's easy to attribute the success of American Giant, but in reality, it's the thousands of men and women that sit behind us. And I dragged two of your colleagues through our supply chain a year and a half ago. They saw that firsthand, but it really is company after company, farmer after farmer that made it all possible, but it required a lot of passion and commitment and risk-taking to get it done.
Could you share with this crowd, when you talk about a wholly American-made piece of clothing, the t-shirt, the sweatshirt, what does that mean?
Well, I'll take you through the apparel supply chain really quickly, and then you can ask more. So it begins, easy to forget this. I think my pitch to the ambassador originally was like, trust me that if you'll give me help people to go through the supply chain, they will see how remarkable any manufacturing process is, but textiles particularly. That textiles, it's easy to forget, begin as an agricultural crop. They start out as cotton, growing in the ground. And so our tour began with Bissett Farms in Enfield, North Carolina, and talking to farmers that are growing cotton in Enfield County, North Carolina. And that cotton gets ginned. You'll remember that from your grade school days. Very different now, very loud and noisy, and gins are domiciled all over the United States wherever there's cotton grown, because the cost of transportation of the gins is expensive. So gins tend to get placed near cotton growing sections. Ginned at the gin. Out of the gin comes cleaned, baled cotton, which goes to a storage facility for a little bit of time, but then to a yarning plant. The one we went to was in Gaffney, South Carolina. That converts raw cotton into yarn, and then to a knitting facility, in that case Clover, South Carolina. Clover Knits, that knits it into cloth. That cloth is called gray cloth because it has the color of natural cotton, the fibers coming out of the ground. And then it moves on to Carolina Cotton Works, in our case, where we sat with the Ashby family, and Ambassador Gittenstein referenced this conversation where I think Jamila asked the question, tell us about your workforce a little bit, and he said, a third of our staff has been here for 40 years, or 14 years, 15 years, whatever the time period was, and a third of our staff has been here for about 5 years, and a third of our staff, we don't know if they're going to show up at work or not today, but I can tell you we're the most stable 8 hours in their day. And that hit me like a ton of bricks, because it had the ring of truth to it, that here in this little town in South Carolina, there's this really important employer that is this anchor of stability that is just, I would argue, is desperately important to our country, and that we've forgotten about for a long time. So the finishing happens there, so that's color and texture. So whether it's these pants or this sweatshirt, it gets this color put on it and a texture to it. And then that finished cloth goes to a cut and sewing facility, in that case in Middlesex, North Carolina, and gets cut and sewn into a finished product. That's the step-through process. And that represents, 70% of our volume are cotton-based knits. The rest are wovens or flannel shirts that have a similar thing, but they take a slightly different path because they don't become knits, they become wovens. It's a slightly different process. A little more complicated, as the book enumerates.
Yes, no, that's right. So there's the book American Flannel by Stephen Koretz. He follows 3 American manufacturers. Bayard is, I feel like, the anchor story in that book, and then also a sock maker too. Bayard, in that book, it's called American Flannel because you got started making the sweatshirt, that famous hoodie, best hoodie of all time, the t-shirt, but the flannel shirt has become a significant accomplishment. I guess no one better to explain to people why the flannel shirt has that level of significance that goes beyond the sweatshirt and the t-shirt.
Well, only in that when I started the company, I sort of spent some time thinking about what I think of as the American canon of styles are, and in my thinking about that, it was the t-shirt, it was the blue jean, it was the flannel shirt, and it was a sweatshirt. Those were sort of the things that I felt embodied American style. And as a product to launch with, the t-shirt felt too insubstantial, blue jeans and flannels felt way too complicated, and so we launched with a sweatshirt. But in the back of my mind was a desire to make those other products. The t-shirt came quite quickly afterwards. But flannel, we never got around to doing, and the more we asked, the more we were told that it just couldn't get done. And it represented to me such an iconic American style. And the way that the classic flannels that I grew up around were made is there was an approach called yarn dyeing, which is the process of actually dyeing the individual strands of yarn. It's an amazing 1/2 craft and 1/2 engineering that's remarkable to see come together. But that had all left, basically. And I kept getting told no and no and no. And eventually I found a guy named James McKinnon from Cotswold Industries. It's another generational textile producer. who was, I don't know, was careless enough to say in a meeting, well, maybe. And I grabbed onto that like a lifeline. I said, what do you mean maybe? Who? And he started, along with many others, down a journey with me of figuring out a way to get it done. But it mattered to me because I felt it symbolized to me something that we lost that I didn't want to give up on.
Yeah. I think this incredible accomplishment that you have in the first phase is demonstrating that it can be done. You can have a 100% American supply chain. You can make t-shirts, sweatshirts, a flannel shirt in America again, and it was by no means easy to get there. But I think that, where we are today in the larger policy conversation around manufacturing policy, trade policy, supply chains is, well, okay, so even if it's possible, it's still going to cost a lot, right? And in the current environment, everybody having come through COVID, the supply chain challenges, inflationary dynamics, price shocks, it's a hard conversation to have today at this point in time. But I think that there's another very, very significant breakthrough and proof of concept that you've accomplished very, very recently, which is with that $12.98 t-shirt. Can you talk us through a little bit of how that came to be?
Yeah, and if I may just respond to the first part of that question, I think it is a hard conversation to have. But I appreciated the ambassador saying earlier that this disconnect between D.C. and a town that he grew up in, and this statistic versus the reality, I would just challenge everybody that cares about this topic to ask a very basic question, which is, what kind of a country are we attempting to build? And is our intent to have a country that has towns and urban centers all across the country that are desperate and hollow? And if you have a 4-year college degree and you've made it into the stock market, you've got a good future in front of you. If you haven't, you are in a really dire place. And that reality is a reality that does not end well for our country. And without getting moralizing beyond that, I think people are not having the courage to have that conversation with, as policymakers, what are we endeavoring to do? What is the outcome we are running for? And if the result is that we need to figure out a way to have stable and good paying jobs throughout the economic sector, including low-skilled workers in rural and urban centers, we have to have an answer for that question. And it is not good enough from my perch in San Francisco to say, we're going to retrain you as a Google engineer. That is not enough. And so, politics aside, we all, as citizens, have to wrestle with that question, I think. So, sorry about that, but I think it's frustrating from the outside, with the notable exceptions like you, Ambassador, who understand this very basic concept, that's not more in the front of the American populace, I think. But so to get your question about the 1298 t-shirt, I had reached a point where, despite our efforts and the amazing work being done for our supply chain partners, where I felt that we had been relegated to the premium end of the market. Our t-shirts retail from $28 to $48. They're great t-shirts, but they're still $48. And that is out of reach for a vast segment of the country, and it is particularly out of reach for the men and women I just was describing. Mm-hmm. And that was a really, for me, a very difficult thing to come to grips with. And I found myself on a podcast 1.5 years ago, and I was doing a rant like that, except this one was about stopping demonizing one another for our political views or for some particular issue we might not agree on, and having the courage to find some common cause with one another. And the host sort of was like, what are you talking about? You're talking too long, get to the punchline. And I said, well, take Walmart, for example. Here's a company that I could disagree with on many things. In some ways, they're very different in many ways from what our core premise is as a brand. And yet, they have made this phenomenal commitment to American-made and American-assembled, grown, made products that I think now is at $350 billion. And we should celebrate that. And we should celebrate it because we are all adults and we can handle the intellectual challenge of, I disagree with some things and I agree on others. And on those things that I agree on and common purpose, I'm going to do whatever I can to find common cause with those people. And that interview made its way into Walmart. They reached out to us and said, hey, we heard this. Thank you. We'd love to talk. We've been struggling with textiles. Walmart, like now, many other brands and retailers in the country are not manufacturers. They're purchase order writers. They don't know how to manufacture things. They're not in the business of manufacturing. They're interested in ordering products. The U.S. textile supply chain is highly atomized now. It's very fragmented. And they were having a hard time with realizing their commitment to apparel. And that began a series of discussions that in the beginning were just about explaining the challenges and what they were running up against, and ultimately resolved in well, what could we do? And I said, well, we could do a T-shirt or a sweatshirt together. What would it take to do that? And I said, it takes, and this is the key point, I think, it takes a commitment of time and a commitment of volume. And Walmart, to their enduring credit, said, well, we can do that. We can give you time, we can give you volume. And they did. And that, what became sort of a year-long development process, resulted in a T-shirt that we launched on the 4th of July, 4 colorways, in 1,700 Walmart doors that retail for $12.98. And that was, had you asked me this a year ago and said, could you get a T-shirt to market with a wholesale margin in between for $20, I would have said, no way. Yep. And so it's a testament to what I think it was missing in many manufacturing sectors, not just textiles, about the lack of a durable framework that allows commitment and volume there. And I'll shut up in 2 seconds. I think when you get down into the textile supply chain, what you find is that the majority of component parts there are family-run businesses, second generation, first generation, third generation, with weak balance sheets. And if you're in that situation, you do not have the ability or the courage, maybe, to make investments in innovation and technology and cross-training and upgrading. And so we're in this stuck point that, in this particular instance, Walmart helped to break up. Mm-hmm. And it's been a great relationship now, and it's growing. And so it's exciting.
So I want to let you know, your story in totality is so extremely inspiring to me, because what you've done in the face of an established understanding about what's possible is to say, I think this is possible. First of all, that you can make things, apparel, entirely with a US-based supply chain. And then second of all, that there are ways to bring that price point down to make it affordable. And I was so impressed by this that this summer I was in Quito for a gathering of trade ministers from the Americas. It was part of our Americas Partnership for Economic Prosperity. And at lunch, we're just chatting, and one of my favorite topics is making things in America, thinking about trade in a different way. And I told them, I said, I have this friend who set out on a task to make T-shirts, hoodies, flannel shirt, entirely in America, and he's done it. And they were mildly impressed.
Mildly impressed.
They were truly, because, right, and I said, the secondary part of it is, well, they are at the high end of the market. But he took it upon himself again to double down on your values, to say, these are the people, these are the Americans that we care about in terms of creating livelihoods and opportunities for them. We also care about them not just as workers, but we also care about them in terms of consumers, that they be able to afford quality product that they can take pride in. And that through a partnership with a retailer that has incredible reach in terms of volume, made a durable commitment, that you have these $12.98 T-shirts now on the market, and they were actually very impressed by that. So I wanted to share that. I think, thank you for pushing back on the frame of that particular question, and I'm actually really enjoying this question and answer for him, because usually I'm stuck doing that part, and I feel this immense sense of lightness to give that responsibility to you. But if we could come back to your answer to that question, which is, when we're looking at the costs and benefits of policy, right? In terms of our trade policy, we've really focused the costs on the balance sheet, the ledger, shareholder value, the efficiencies, that kind of Milton Friedman, Chicago School approach to trickle-down neoliberal, right? I think that one of the lessons that I've taken from my conversations with you is, and in the example that you've just illustrated, is that's an incredibly narrow sense of cost and benefit. That there have been significant costs to the fabric of American life, and this feeling of opportunity and this feeling of economic security that is very thin and brittle right now. And that's if we can bake that into the economics and the calculus, that's the pathway that we need to come back. And I wanted to test this against how you feel in your job as a founder and CEO of American Giant. I was listening to a podcast maybe a week and a half ago about American trade policy since NAFTA. And the reporter who was reporting on the closing down of a master lock facility, and this was someone for the New York Times, Dan Kaufman for the New York Times, had said, did you know that studies have shown that the loss of a job is equivalent in terms of its emotional and human impact to the loss of a spouse? What really struck me then was that humanizing of the cost of these trade, the human cost of the trade policies and the economic policies that we have pursued. My father passed away 5 years ago. My mother is the toughest person I have ever met and have ever known. The impact of the loss of my father on my mother was so profound. And then to then understand that, that's the impact of what we have been doing to these communities in rural America, across America, for now a couple generations, starts to explain a lot about why we are where we are today.
Yeah, and in service of what? I mean, in service of maybe back to the original point, a cheaper T-shirt? I mean, maybe that's the right decision. I would challenge, to quote the ambassador, the eggheads in D.C. and at Harvard about that. Is that the right objective? That we benefit? And I don't mean, we all are smart enough to understand the benefit of being able to have a $4 T-shirt versus a $12 T-shirt. I understand that. But at what cost to our fellow citizens? And that, I think hearing the ambassador's discussion about his town versus when he was a kid, it's enumerated in the book as well, with Woolrich leaving Pennsylvania, and Stephen Kurtz grew up in that town and watched that departure and all of the, sorry for the analogy, but the fabric of that community get destroyed. At what cost? And I'm not an economist. I don't understand trade policy particularly well. I am smart enough to know that when you go into those towns and you see it up close, it feels like a death. It feels like, wow, this town that was vibrant, that had a heartbeat, that had 5 local restaurants, that had a functional school board, that had a parks commission, that cared about the goings and comings of the members of that community, is now hollowed out, and people are there don't have jobs. They're sort of whiling the time away. They feel like they're completely left behind. And so I think I don't think that we are humanizing the cost of that policy enough. I know you are, and I know you're a tireless advocate for it, but collectively, I mean, as a country, we're not humanizing it enough. Yeah, it is one that I get very animated about, and I'd love the opportunity to carry that water on behalf of advocates like you, because I think it's easier to do when you're on the manufacturing side of the conversation, maybe, to point out what the impacts of that have been over the years.
One last point I want to make sure to draw out in this conversation for everyone else's benefit. I was visiting a steel mill in Coatesville, Pennsylvania last week, and Scott was there with us. And just to see just the enormity of these slabs of steel that these people were making, the company and its workers, that there were 3rd, 4th, and 5th generation steel workers there. And these are slabs of steel that then go on into commercial shipbuilding, but they have a lot of business with the defense and military industry. So that steel also goes into ships, aircraft carriers, submarines. What I came away with was this very, very clear, palpable sense of pride that people have in what they are making, what they stand for, and their role in America as Americans. That's something I wanted to bring back, because I also have been listening to the podcast recording that you did with Guy Raz and How I Built This. And there's a phrase that you use throughout, and I wondered if you could unpack it a little bit for me, because I think that it really captures very beautifully a part of that pride, which is, you've called it a nonpartisan patriotism. Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that phrase?
Just that. I think it is ridiculous to think that let's just say the right has taken hold of patriotism and manufacturing or whatever it is, it drives me crazy. I think collectively as Americans, I think it's quite logical and important for us to understand that is figuring out a way to help our fellow citizens with good, prideful jobs. And I think, listening to you talk about that, there's two things I want to sort of mention about that. I think one is a sense of purpose that comes along with a good job. And I would argue that is particularly attached to manufacturing jobs. There's something important culturally to be in the business of making things still, whether it's a T-shirt or whether it's rolled steel or whatever it is. But I think that it is one of the areas that I hope that Americans, whatever their political stripe may be, believe in the importance of helping to fix this situation we've gotten ourselves into. And I believe it is nonpartisan nature. And I think if I could just speak personally with you for a second, from the moment I met you, I was struck by that patriotism of you in a totally nonpartisan way, about just in the harness and pulling for the country in a way that we just need to be doing. And I think that we've gotten so lost in the rancor in DC that this is one of the areas where I hope people clearly see that this is an obvious place to be nonpartisan about it and just patriotic about it and be together as Americans trying to figure out, we've gotten ourselves into a bit of a spot and how we best get out of it, and so that we can take care of each other in ways that we have not been for a while, I think.
I don't know that I can add any more to that, other than just to say that I do think that the term patriotism is quite powerful, because it is about the pride that you have in yourself, your country, and our fellow Americans. That's actually agnostic about what other people are doing.
Yep.
In fact, again, I spend lots of times with trade ministers from other countries, and they think that we are all patriotic.
Yep.
We are all trying to make our economy stronger, to create more opportunity for our people so that we can all be doing better. And I think that there has to be a way that we can do that, including through our trade policy, where we're not pitting ourselves against each other,
100%.
but we're looking for ways to lift everyone up. And there's a whole lot of that work that we need to do here. I think a lot of what we've been talking about in terms of trade policy, also being manufacturing policy, also being social policy, is about a very, very positive vision for where we're trying to go. And it sits within maybe a concept that we've been talking quite a lot about here in Washington among the eggheads, but in the White House and in the administration, this concept of economic security. There's economic security for the nation that is intricately tied to the economic security of individual people, workers, the sense of hope, that sense of stability in a person's life. And then the link between that economic security then also to national security. And I mention all of these taglines because there are linked to active policy discussions, debates, and policy formulation activities that we're engaged in here in the Biden-Harris administration that I think are going to be beautifully highlighted by our next panel, with Heather Boucher on the economic side, Dalip Singh on the national security side. And I'm not going to try to do your job, Scott, except to say that these two conversations have to be taken together, including with Ambassador Gittenstein's opening remarks and his reflections on his own family experience. There's this one other story that Ambassador Gittenstein has told that I've been in the presence for, where he talks about growing up Jewish in a rural Alabama town as the son of this shirt factory owner. And what was really interesting about it, we were at a diversity, equity, inclusion event, and he was reflecting on his own experience, and he said, well, because his father's factory was such a central part of the vitality of that community, he never felt like the odd kid out, that there was something cohering. And there was something about that community experience that made you feel like you were on the same team. I think that's something that I keep coming back to in this season, which is we all have to be conceiving of ourselves as being on the same team. That's you in the economy as a manufacturer, Those of us inside the government structures doing policy, our consumers, our workers, all of us have to be pulling in the same direction in order for all of us to succeed.
Yeah, if I may, I just was speaking at Walmart in Bentonville a few weeks ago, and before I got on stage, I went to the bathroom, and there was a photograph of Sam Walton on the wall, and it said underneath him, a quote from him, it said, "The big secret is we're all on the same team." And I talked about that on stage, because what you're saying is exactly right, that we've got to get into that framework and that frame of mind, that it's absolutely the truth, that a good, healthy, worker-centered economic policy is good for America broadly. Uncontroversial, it's just true, we got to wrestle with it. And I will say that I had this conversation with Scott before we came out, that I'm just deeply grateful for your work and service, because I think it's rare, and it's being heard in the manufacturing sector, in the textile world, in small little facilities all across the country. So I'm sure you're aware of that, but I want you to hear it from me, that it is something that really has an impact. And so really grateful for the nonpartisan nature of your service. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I think that there are so many ways in which we have to make our trade policies better. We need to make our trade policies better for more of America and more Americans. And in terms of our view on inclusivity, it is to see everyone who we have disappointed and hurt along the way, and to figure out how to make amends and how to learn from those lessons so that we don't make them again. Yep. But thank you very, very much, and I look forward to the next conversation.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. You were great. Thank you so much. Our live stream audience is just going to see a holding slide while we set the panel. I'm going to invite Heather to come up with me. And Dalip Singh of the National Security Council had hoped to join us in person. Not surprisingly, in the national security place, crises come up, imagine that. And so he needs to stay kind of close to his desk, and he's going to be joining us, and has joined us
There he is.
Virtually. So look at this, we are 2 for 2. Please, I'll just give them a very brief formal introduction. Heather Boucher is on the Biden-Harris Council of Economic Advisors. She's also the chief economist for the Investing in America cabinet, which obviously has an enormous amount of responsibility to see all the massive public investments in things like semiconductors, infrastructure, other aspects of microelectronics, and the clean energy economy get made. Dalip Singh is at the National Security Council, and he's the deputy primarily responsible for international economic policy. And this is especially a joy because in a former job, I worked on Capitol Hill at a time when Democrats were not largely united on trade policies. And I used to yell at the Council of Economic Advisors and the National Security Council a lot. And so it is truly extraordinary and amazing to see the alignment. I never thought this day would come, but alas, here we are. Please give a warm welcome to both Heather and to Dalip. So I first wanted, and I'll do it with Heather first, and ask Dalip to weigh in as well. And I just kind of previewed this, is that we have seen over a number of years, over the last couple of years, a number of very significant game-changing investments in the economy. I guess, that has formed really an industrial policy, which we can talk about now, which we were not able to talk about a decade or 2 decades ago, but it is here. And in your mind and your thinking as this has developed, there are obviously both kind of domestic arguments and global competitiveness and geopolitical arguments for all of this. But from your space, why was it important that this happened at this time, Heather?
Why? Okay, that's a great question. So when Joe Biden ran for office, we were facing a series of economic crises. Of course, we're in the middle of a pandemic. But the thing that we knew is that as we were experiencing that pandemic, it unmasked a whole host of other deeper problems, a lot of which were well known and some of which really bubbled up. And I think first about the supply chain shocks to the economy. Many of us have been kind of watching that and being like, this seems like it could be a problem. But here it was for all the world to see, the lack of resiliency of our supply chains, which is really grounded in where we make things and how we make them. And then, of course, we knew that we were, at that moment in time, having to deal with the existential crisis of climate change, and hadn't been able to get in the United States to a solution. And realizing that really the real solution was that we needed to build that new clean energy economy. We need to build a new economy on a new kind of energy. And how are we going to do that? And then at the same time, we were in a moment when we were looking at almost half a century of rising economic inequality domestically. And that has had economic implications across communities across the country, but also political implications. So you had these overlapping crises that were interconnected, right? The deindustrialization of large parts of America was connected to the long-standing economic inequality. And how we think about manufacturing, how we think about what we make in this country, really connected to where we would be in the new clean energy global ecosystem. What part did we want to play in that? So there were a whole bunch of challenges and a whole bunch of really pressing questions that we needed answers to. And so yes, we do call it a modern American industrial strategy. Brian Deese did a couple of important speeches, laying that out, along with a number of other colleagues. But that idea that what we make in America and how we make it became core to thinking about this pivot that the president wanted to do to change the economy, so we didn't just build back from the pandemic, but that we built back better. And if I could briefly,
Please.
The three tenets of that, right? The what are we doing? So one is that we're investing in America, all across America. So those foundational investments in infrastructure, long needed, but also sector-based, productivity-enhancing investments in parts of the economy that we believe are important for American competitiveness now and into the future. Semiconductors and clean energy, those are the things we need to do now. If we don't do that, where will we be 10, 20 years from now, let alone where are we now? But the investments on their own aren't enough. Two things. One is that we've spent a lot of time thinking about how to make sure that markets are fair and competitive, both domestically and internationally. Ambassador Tai, I know, spoke about that. Dileep's going to talk about that on the international side. But we've also been thinking domestically, how do we shape markets to be fair and competitive? What does it mean to cultivate new industries? That we want them to be vibrant, to have opportunity for new entrants, but also to be able to be globally competitive. How do we do that? And then the outcome that we're always looking for, right? The point of all of this, the point of our economic policy is for workers to be paid a good wage, for families to thrive, for communities to thrive. That's the ultimate outcome we're looking for. It flows through having competitive, viable industries in things that matter, that we need to produce. But then are we taking every step we can to make sure that we are always coming at our industrial strategy with a worker-first approach, as the president has been saying, making sure that we're creating good jobs, creating opportunities for unions, creating opportunities for communities across the country to see the kind of economic growth that they need to see. So it's investing, shaping markets to be fair and competitive, worker-first. That is the solution to these decade-long challenges, we think, on lack of resiliency, addressing climate change, addressing inequality, addressing American competitiveness and national security. But that's a Dileep topic. So.
And that is a very good segue. Thank you, Heather, to Dileep. And so as Heather was describing some of the internal factors, Dileep, in your mind, why, from a geopolitical perspective, was it important that the Biden and Harris administration embark on this policy?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I mean, I actually don't make a distinction between the domestic and global factors because in my mind, the whole premise of industrial policy is that the private sector, left entirely to itself, it's just not designed to confront the biggest challenges that we face to economic security or national security or democracy itself. And as Heather mentioned, I mean, the pandemic exposed this reality with a punctuation mark, but most of these challenges had been growing for decades during the era of hyperglobalization. So Heather mentioned the brittle nature of our supply chains. I would add the fading of our technological preeminence. You've been talking today about the hollowing out of our industrial base and our manufacturing capacity. Heather mentioned the compounding climate crisis. I would also add inequality and social cleavages continuing to rise from extreme levels. And I would broaden it out to say the political evil that's been sweeping across Western democracies across the world, it's symptomatic of an exhausted post-Cold War model of political economy that assumed private sector actors had the incentives to solve these problems by themselves, and that non-economic actors, in other words, geopolitical forces, were entirely benign. In other words, that it was the end of history for geopolitical competition. And those assumptions were just flat wrong. So much as Heather is describing, I mean, the premise of what we've been doing for the past 3.5 years is that market failures exist, that we can identify them, and that they can be corrected with targeted government interventions. And they come in all sorts of different forms: tax policy, regulatory shifts, investment subsidies, government procurement, certainly trade measures, competition policy, and our national security posture. All of it needs to fit together to basically alter the structure of economic activity in a way that better aligns with our national interests. And by the way, I don't think any of this is new or radical. It goes all the way back to the founding of our country, and we all know about Hamilton, but there's a through line through Lincoln and Roosevelt with the RCA, and certainly the post-Sputnik era. And arguably every major advance of the digital age is in some ways been supported by a collaboration between government, academia, and the private sector. That's what we're doing again.
Yes.
Thank you for lifting that up. And I literally say that all the time to my boys. They don't understand, but Dilip nailed it there on the rationale and the historical through lines through all of this. So Ambassador Tai mentioned this, and I'm wondering what your response is to this as well, because a lot of this upended the orthodox thinking about interventions or picking winners or losers, or that the model of the future is that China makes and we buy, right, and we'll just design and digitize. Why is all of that wrong?
Oh my gosh, where to start? How much time do you have? So let me just, a few things. So first, I think that a lot of scholars have long been documenting that there's a deep connection between what happens in universities and the tech and the innovation, and then how that plays out through an economy, what it looks like on the shop floor, and that there's an interplay between those, and having those so spread apart and disconnected as though the brainy people sit over here and they just come up with ideas, but it's actually disconnected from the making of the thing, isn't really the way innovation, the best innovation can happen. So that's one piece of the puzzle. But I think taking a bigger step back, for a long time, and quite frankly through most of my professional career, economic policy was run on the idea that what we made, the composition of our economy didn't matter. We lived in a global economy, the world is flat, you can get whatever you want from whatever you want, wherever around the world, and we can all trade with one another, and we've made that all fair, so what you're making in any particular place doesn't matter. Now there's a few flaws with that. First off, as we've seen during the pandemic, there's questions about resiliency. There's questions about, how far things are being shipped. We spend too little time actually talking about the climate consequences of shipping, but that's a different conversation, but certainly something in the back of our minds. And as the climate is changing, we know that there's more and more challenges with long-term shipping. This year we were all watching the droughts in the Panama Canal, and what that would do to shipping is just one example of things that are making that model less resilient, perhaps, moving forward. So that's one reason that place matters. But then, of course, there are so many other reasons that place matters, but when you start thinking about it from a national security lens, from an energy security lens, as well as from an economic security lens, what you're making in particular places, that composition of those industries, you realize actually does start to matter. So I want to just focus on clean energy for a moment. We are moving from a world where we have been using fossil fuels that are traded on a global marketplace in many cases, into a world where we're manufacturing energy. And yet we've allowed a new system to start to be formed where one country is dominating upwards of 90% of core parts of that new supply chain. So most of the pieces are being produced in a place that gives that country a lot of control over our access to these new technologies. So whether or not you agree with my first point that there's a really important interaction between what happens in innovation, what happens on the shop floor, if you're allowing a monopoly to get in the middle of something that is in everything that we use every day, that is also a really important lack of resiliency indicator that we need to be thinking about. So place really matters when you're thinking about something like energy security, which is, of course, fundamental to so many of the issues that we're talking about in our Invest in America agenda. But economists, for a long time, were like, those things were just, I mean, I don't know. I don't want to speak for the whole profession, but the idea that the places of those things mattered wasn't just, it hasn't been top of mind. It has been, oh, those are other people's problems. Well, that might be a national security issue, or that's an energy issue, but that's not something that we really need to be thinking about as we're thinking about our national economy. And I think what shifted, and again, I think the pandemic was really the catalyst, but these had been building for a long time, was the president coming in and saying, actually, what we make here really matters. It matters for our resiliency. If we're going to move to a clean energy economy, we can't be dependent entirely on China for core parts of this new supply chain. We have to rethink that. And then we have to think about what kinds of jobs we're creating in communities across the country and what's happening between universities and the high tech and the innovation and how that is actually filtering out into the kinds of jobs and industries that we're creating for people. So place actually does really matter. So I think that, and I would say that the economics profession is still struggling with this. There's a lot of questions. I was at a lunch today where people are like, industrial strategy, I don't believe in it. But then when you start actually unpacking what we're talking about, well, do you believe in energy security, sir? Do you understand that, that there are these bottlenecks? Oh, well, actually, you're right, we need to do something about that. Well, you can't pick winners and losers. Well, the policies that the Biden-Harris administration has put in place, in large part, aren't putting their thumb on the scale of company A or company B. A lot of this is tax credits that any company can just you file your taxes and you say, I want to produce clean energy or I want to do this investment, and you apply for these tax credits and you get more if you do things that we really want you to do, like invest in low-income places or use prevailing wages. But it's an open process. So that is really saying the sector is important, government enabled, but private sector led, allowing the private sector to do what it does best. So I think that my hope is that the econ community will come around, but it requires us to actually kind of pushing through the questions there with them.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And Dilip, I'll pose the question to you, I guess, in a different way, is that oftentimes U.S. policy and trade policy or the types of investments that we're making, trade was very much viewed as, I guess, an instrument of diplomacy for a long time, particularly during the Cold War, or an instrument to bring out more democratization, I guess, in the case of China. And there were certain expectations that I guess U.S. The countries had of the United States. And so, I do think, and I agree with Heather here, that there were a lot of misperceptions about what the policy is really. But I'm wondering from an international perspective, Dilip, what you see this kind of fundamental shift and what it represents, and how both our allies and geopolitical competitors should be thinking about it.
Yeah, and in the old days, or not so old days, only a few years ago, really, our trade policy was based on this notion that we could identify, our comparative advantages as being X, and the rest of the world having comparative advantages in everything else, and that would work out well for us. But the flaw, of course, that we've come to realize is that what we're good at doing, our comparative advantage, if you want to sound fancy, it's not endowed by destiny or given to any country as some kind of divine right. It's in large part a choice that we need to be deliberate in making. And so the entire logic of trade policy has been based on this very flawed assumption, because what we're good at producing in the future depends very much on what we produce well today and whether we did so yesterday. In other words, path dependency really matters because learning effects are real. The more you make of something, the more productive and creative you can get. Look at TSMC with semiconductors. And economies of scale are real, especially in manufacturing. It allows you to make investments in being more productive and to offset large upfront costs. and to become more profitable with every marginal unit you make. And the last thing is that we now talk about with counterparts is that ecosystems matter. So the better we are at building and producing, the better we're going to be at innovating. And that's why industrial clusters exist. That's why we can't outsource an industry like manufacturing abroad and think that we're going to have prosperity and equity in our society. So the only point I'm making, and this comes up now in every single one of my conversations with counterparts who are trying to understand the logic of the IRA and the CHIPS Act and the infrastructure bill, is that comparative advantage is created, it compounds, and it does not happen by by chance.
Thank you for explicating that, Dilip. I'm going to turn back to you for another specific question, and this is about a concept that we're hearing a lot from the administration that I think we've had a lot of alignment on, and that is the concern about industrial overcapacity in some countries, particularly non-market economies, and you know, I hear Secretary Yellen, I hear other administration officials, the ambassador, everybody talking about this consistently, and it's obviously important as the kind of the world's largest consumer for us to raise this up. But I'm wondering if our allies view the industrial overcapacity that we've seen both in traditional industries and then new and emerging industries like EVs in China, if our allies are sharing a similar level of concern to what the Biden-Harris administration is demonstrating right now.
I'd say a growing number of countries are starting to diagnose the problem the way that we do. The EU, Canada, Brazil, India, Indonesia, South Africa, Chile, Thailand. I'm just naming a few countries that are top of mind that are starting to talk about the problem that's confronting the world, because it's not just confronting the US. And China, we should just be clear about it. China is flooding strategic sectors with supply that's well beyond what global demand can plausibly absorb, and therefore wiping out the competition. And it's not a new problem. We've seen China run this play for the better part of the past 2 decades to gain dominance in steel and solar and wind and medical devices and machine tools. And what's happening now is the trend is broadening and intensifying to batteries and EVs and semiconductors, and a lot of sectors in which we're making hundreds of billions of dollars of investments to rebuild our industrial capacity, and so are other countries. And other countries recognize the starting point is that China already accounts for 30% of the global manufacturing sector in value-added terms, which is more than the US and Germany and Japan and India and Mexico combined. So they're starting to come around. And look, we tell our counterparts, it would be one thing if China's growing market share in strategic sectors was the result of indigenous innovation and market forces. If that were the case, we might just applaud the positive spillovers that the rest of the world would benefit from. But we all know, and I think they know, the reality is China is producing at the size and scale that it is with free credit, cheap land, dirty energy, uneven regulations, and in some cases forced labor in ways that massively distort the competition and create a very uneven playing field. So, what we say to them is this is the competitive landscape we're in. It's not the one we would choose. And the only way for us to compete is to collaborate. So number one, as Heather's alluded to, we're gonna make investments at home to strengthen and scale our productive capacity. Number two, we want partnerships with countries playing by the same rules to give each other access to our productive capacity and our purchasing power. But number three, for countries not playing by the same rules, we are going to use restrictive tools like tariffs to prevent our investments from getting undercut, because the harm from doing nothing to our economic strategy, to our national security, and to our democracy, those costs are unacceptable.
Thank you, Dilip. Heather, I want to turn back to you for I guess, a more granular examination of this policy. I mean, I'm excited when people will look back on this as an era of emerging industrial strategy, but obviously how it's doing now matters a lot as well, and how it's implemented matters a lot. And we've seen things that have worked well in the past in industrial policy, things that haven't worked well. One of the, I think, the innovations, and you alluded to this, is that there are some performance standards that come along with this, like job quality is important, and preventing leakage by having procurement preferences or other things like that with respect to prevailing wage. And so I'm wondering, why that was important to include to make the policy successful, and if there's some examples that you can give of how we're seeing this in action today.
Well, I think so there's a lot of reasons why an industrial strategy may not work, right? But one of them is that, I think in the US case, I think about prior administrations that have focused on tax cuts as a strategy to spur investment, or claims that this would revitalize manufacturing, or tax cuts and tariffs, but just that alone. And what we saw in the prior administrations, that actually did not lead to an increase in investment in the construction of new manufacturing facilities across the United States, whereas here we've seen a doubling. A doubling in that investment over the course since we got the Invest in America agenda passed, since CHIPS and Science Act and the IRA was put in place. That is when you look at just that chart alone, I'm always taken aback a little bit. I'm like, wow, that's right, this is huge. This is a huge increase in manufacturing investment. And so your question is, well, why? Why did this work, and what does that mean? I think that part of this is because we took this approach that is not just about whether or not the firm has a little bit more money or has the protection abroad, through tariffs to make that investment, but are we doing all of the things that is actually going to allow that manufacturer in that community to thrive as a part of an industry, because it's not just them, they've got suppliers, they've got all these other pieces in a community where that firm can thrive. I've been doing a lot of travel over the past year, and as of yesterday, I hit 19 states, and visiting a lot of these manufacturing sites. You were in Pennsylvania at Cleveland Cliffs. We were in Cleveland at Cleveland Works, watching them do steel stuff. We can get into that, technical terms. Steel stuff. I'm with manufacturers, I'm a little embarrassed, I don't know all the words. But one of the things that comes across when you talk to, we did a business roundtable, when you talk to folks there, is that this isn't just about the factory, it's about everything around it. It's around, everywhere we go, people start talking about workforce. And the communities that are really thriving are the ones where that workforce component, the community college, the workforce development agency, the university, is in the room with the manufacturers and the other business leaders, and they are communicating, they're working together, they're talking about all the great programs they have, how many graduates they're, all of that. And those are the places where it's not like, oh, what are we going to do about workforce, federal person? It's, oh, we see that we have a challenge and we are actually solving that problem. And part of what we have incentivized is giving communities and businesses the resources and the incentive to do that. So through encouraging businesses to adopt community benefit agreements, well, that's a way of saying, hey, you're not alone, you are a part of a community. How can you make sure that this works not just for you, but for the community, because that's how you'll be successful. I also, though, think, one of the things that I've learned about the success is that there's a couple of things about the here and now. One is that we're building a lot of new manufacturing, and that's awesome, but the jobs haven't shown up yet. And at least in places I visited, it's because the factories are still, they still got big boxes. They're still putting stuff together. They're still putting roofs on things. They're not done yet. So that's still to come. So I think that's hard for communities to see unless you're in kind of that inner circle. But then there's a lot of other issues around those communities, especially when you're investing, because we are disproportionately investing in communities that are in the bottom half of their incomes are lower than the typical median around the country. Communities need those other supports. They need to make sure that they have money for childcare or for care for the aging and disabled. Do they have the funding for good schools? Are they able to pair this in a way with their bipartisan infrastructure law money so that the roads and bridges and all the different pieces? We were just in a town that was using a lot of their ARP money, American Rescue Plan money, to deal with housing blight, which is, again, affecting the viability of the industry, the manufacturers in that community. So the places that I've seen be most effective are the ones that are able to put all those pieces together at a community level. And then I'm sure you can have a whole separate, I could give given a whole separate answer around the ecosystem around those manufacturing communities themselves. But I thought I'd go with the social side, and we can come back another time for the manufacturing side.
No, that's good. What you saw, I think, was called melting and pouring.
Oh, well, no, I didn't see the melting and pouring. I saw the squeezing. It was the squeezing from the plate squeezing.
All right. I would say from the ecosystem perspective, the administration's strategy is also exciting because of some of the procurement mechanisms that are in place that help upstream, downstream, and so that it's not just the assembler that's benefiting from this as well. So I think that approach has helped. Dilip, one last question before I let you go virtually here, is that Heather responded to some of the criticism that we see aimed at kind of industrial strategies. The other question I hear a lot, I'm sure you do too, is like, well, how does this differ from what, like, say, China is doing or has done in the past, or we've seen this? And I'm just going to let you handle that. How is that different?
Well, it's a fair question, Scott. Yeah. We're trying our best to define in numbers what exactly is the problem of Chinese overcapacity. How much of a distortion are they creating to competition? And so there are a few different metrics that I've actually shared with my counterpart, and that increasingly G7 peers are also putting in front of their counterparts in China. So, for example, volume-based metrics. We can look at the numbers. What is China's domestic production trajectory in EVs or batteries or semiconductors or manufactured goods more generally? How does that compare to the global demand trajectory? There's an imbalance that's very obvious, and you can see it in their capacity utilization rates. I can look at nominal variables, so like what's happening to inflation in China. And when supply is greatly outstripping demand, prices fall, and unsurprisingly in China, at the producer level, they've been stuck in deflation for years now. I can then point to financial metrics. So what we see in China are persistent losses from a large share of leading producers and exporters. And then you can just measure the policy distortions themselves directly. And what you'll find, different third parties have measured this in different ways, but we're seeing an unrivaled level and rate of growth in China's subsidies. And in public forget about the numbers, look at their public pronouncements to dominate key sectors and diffuse them with military preeminence, and to fail to report them to the WTO or any other third party that you might think of. But ultimately, just look at market structure. It's increasingly concentrated. China has a growing amount of market power, and it's using that market power in ways that give it economic and geopolitical leverage. So that's the problem, and it's not abstract. You can see it in the numbers. I think over time we may have a composite metric that can compare how is it changing across time in China, how does it compare to other countries, and you'll find that they're a big outlier, and we got to do something about it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think the evidence is very strong, just based on the 5-year plans to build on the global domination of these industries. So it's not just trying to launch and capitalize important industries of the future or to rebuild them like we're doing here. There's a significant difference in the goals and the impacts that it has on the rest of the world as we're setting these policies out. I think we are at a time, but I wanted to thank Heather. I wanted to thank Dilip. I wanted to thank the ambassador and her team. I want to thank the team at AAM that made this possible, and for all of you for tuning in. I just want to summarize it in saying how excited I am about the possibilities for making it in America based on all of these strategies, because I don't think we've ever seen them harmonized like this. Again, other than like in wartime or in crisis. And I think this is the really important thing. And then I think if you look at the early days of the administration, from establishing the Made in America office, the appointments that it made, the significant investments, the game-changing investments in semiconductors and clean energy and in infrastructure, and the fact that it's backstopped by procurement policy and by trade policy, and tariffs were appropriate. That is a very cohesive, industrial strategy, and also to have the performance standards in to ensure that it is middle out impact as well. And I think that is a feature, and then it just takes the imagination of entrepreneurs like Bayard, who we saw, and instead of like sitting in their MBA classes, not to impugn anybody who did this at Stanford or Harvard or whatever, very smart people, but you're taught something different than you see in the real world, and if you have that imagination backstopped by the policy, you can make a lot happen, and American Giant's proof of that. So thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Sorry not to be there in person.
All right. Thank you so much.